What's the scariest real story you have? Story 1. I was walking down the street with a friend during college. A woman was driving down the street, and a little girl passed us. She was about 7 or 8 years old. She was walking a dog and passed by some bushes that extended out to the street. This was near an old park that was not maintained very well. The woman who was driving did not see the girl and hit her and the dog. They were thrown in two different directions. From the way they landed, it was obvious they had died. One of them made a sickening crunch sound on impact, but I do not know if it was the girl or the dog. Then the woman got out and started screaming and crying. She was yelling at me that she could not go to jail and that she did not see them. I was trying to tell her that she would not get arrested because it was an accident, and my friend was calling for help on her phone. This woman then told me to move away from her, so I did, because she was hysterical. She ran back to her car, removed her purse, and took out a gun. She shot herself and collapsed onto the hood of the car. I was in shock. I had just witnessed two people and an animal die. After that, I felt completely numb and devoid of reactions. Later, I was told by a therapist that she might have been on substances, which could explain her reaction. I still wonder why we all had to be involved in that situation. I think about that little girl and the dog all the time. She would have been around 21 years old now. Story 2. One of my friends passed away in a car accident when I was in high school. We were involved in a lot of after-school activities together. The night before she passed away, we had play rehearsal after school. I was at the vending machine getting a soda when she asked if she could borrow $1 so she could get one too, and she promised she would pay me back later. It was no problem, so I gave her $1 and went on my way. The next morning, I found out that she had passed away on her way to school. Fast forward several years later, I was moving and started going through some of my old things from high school. I was looking through old pictures and yearbooks when I came across the obituary I had saved from her funeral. I stared at her picture on the front of it for a while. When I opened it to read the inside, a single dollar fell out. She had kept her word. I still have that dollar. I could never bring myself to spend it, and I do not think I ever will. Story 3. When I was in college, during finals week, my two best friends and I would meet up after a long night in the library to smoke marijuana and then go our separate ways for the night, since they lived on campus while I lived off campus. I would pick them up in my car after I finished studying, and we would park in a large commuter parking lot overlooking a wide river and wooded area. It was around midnight, and we were doing the usual, smoking and listening to music, when we noticed a local police officer driving around with a spotlight in the nearly empty parking lot. Paranoia set in, so we put everything away and waited in silence for him to leave. Eventually he did, and we continued sitting there. All of a sudden, a woman appeared out of nowhere, looking completely disheveled, and stopped directly in front of my car, staring through the windshield at us. A chill ran down my spine, and I could not understand why she was doing that. She eventually walked away into the woods. At that point, I was ready to leave, but the one of us who had not seen her directly was convinced we were just overly paranoid. So we stayed. I was shaking and felt deeply uneasy and unsafe, so I kept looking over my left shoulder behind my car. My friends joked about how strange that was, while I remained locked in a sense that something was very wrong. A few minutes later, after I had started checking less often, I looked behind my car again and saw the same woman sprinting toward the driver's door with a knife in her hand. My body reacted instantly. I started the car without saying a word and sped out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was completely off campus. She had circled the entire parking lot, moving around all the cars and approaching mine from behind. Later, we found out the police had been searching for her. She had previously killed her husband and the woman he had been involved with. The police believed she was planning to violently steal my car. It was, without question, the scariest experience of my life, and my friends would agree. Story 4. When Pokemon Go first became extremely popular, my wife, her brother, and I drove to downtown Huntsville, Alabama. We had been walking around for a while when a man approached us, asking if we could spare a few dollars. He said he had just gotten out of jail, but I told him I did not carry cash, and he went on his way. That interaction made me tense, and I found myself watching everyone around us for the rest of the night. He did not seem like a bad person, but the realization that we were in a dangerous area put me on edge. About an hour later, I noticed a different, younger guy walking around without a phone. He seemed to be alone, which struck me as odd, but I assumed it had something to do with how close we were to several large apartment buildings. After a while, we started to feel safe again and decided to venture farther from the park. That was when the younger guy with no phone began following us. We turned around halfway down a street. He stopped, waited, and then fell back in behind us. This went on for a few minutes, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw him reaching into his waistband. I knew exactly what was about to happen, so without turning around, I lifted the back of my shirt and let him see my Beretta. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but his intentions were clear, and he was making his move. I have never seen someone disappear so quickly. After that, we left Huntsville and never went out at 1 in the morning to play Pokemon Go again. Before anyone judges me, I had a permit, I tried my best to avoid the situation, and I had my wife to protect. I do not know if he had a gun or a knife, but I did not want to find out. Story 5. A lot of disturbing and scary things have happened to me, but this is one I have not told countless times. A friend and I were walking my dog to the park in our neighborhood when we noticed a young guy we had never seen before standing across the street from the park. He was acting very strangely, hitting objects, yelling at nothing, and carrying himself in an aggressive way. He crossed the street and started walking toward us. My dog did not like him at all, which was a bad sign because she usually liked everyone. We turned and walked away, but he followed us, jerking and jolting like he could not control his own body. We started walking faster to create some distance. We decided to take the back way, and I noticed two older men heading in that direction and hoped they could be potential backup if needed. Before we turned the corner, we looked back and saw that the guy was sprinting full speed toward us. We ran and caught up to the two men and quickly explained what was happening. When we looked back again, the guy was standing by a flagpole at the end of the street, marching in place and laughing and screaming, with a deeply disturbing look on his face. The men told us to go home, not to worry, and they walked back toward him. I have no idea what happened after that, and I never saw that guy again. Story 6. This happened when I was 18 years old. I was working at a bakery, and my coworker, who was also a friend, asked if I wanted to smoke marijuana with him at his place after our shift. I agreed, and we went to his apartment. While we were smoking, we started talking about psychedelic experiences, and he described a really bad mushroom trip he once had, calling it pure emotional torture. He could not fully explain what made it so awful, only that it involved a horrible mental spiral, losing control of his thoughts and feeling completely insane. It was deeply unsettling, and I could tell it still affected him. Eventually, he put his head in his hands and said that he really wished he could just forget it all. There was an awkward pause, probably because he felt exposed after saying that. Then, without warning, he grabbed his stomach, winced in pain, and ran toward the bathroom. I heard his footsteps racing down the hall, followed by an incredibly loud crash. I ran after him and found his body lying face down on the floor, completely straight, his arms at his sides, stiff like a board. Blood was dripping into the bathtub, and I realized he must have smashed his face on it. I sat him up and tried to clean him as his nose and mouth poured blood all over his shirt. I asked him what had happened, but he was extremely disoriented and confused. It quickly became clear that he had short-term memory loss, and about every 30 seconds, he would forget everything. He remembered basic things like his name and what city we were in, but he could not remember who I was, where we worked, or what we had been doing before the incident. Even when I explained it to him, he would forget again within less than a minute, forcing me to repeat everything. After about 10 minutes, he suddenly vomited all over his bed. At that point, I completely panicked and called the paramedics, then went with him to the hospital. I wrote "everything is going to be okay" on his hand with a marker, in case he forgot why he was there or what was happening. I stayed with him at the hospital and we drew in my sketchbook until morning, until the nurses eventually asked me to leave him to rest. The entire time, he was still experiencing memory loss, but a few days later I saw him again and he seemed fully recovered. He is a very close friend of mine now, and we often refer to that night as the moment we truly became close. There is still a strange mystery surrounding that experience for me, and I cannot explain how his wish to forget everything was granted so suddenly and violently. I have no idea why he jumped up, ran to the bathroom, or slipped and hit his face on the tub. It felt as if his bad trip story somehow built up into that terrifying moment of memory loss. Story 7. In 2006, I went to Germany with some friends, and I am from Italy. We had planned to camp in the Black Forest with a group from Germany, a group from Switzerland, and a group from Hungary. It sounded pretty cool. One night, some friends and I really had to use the bathroom, but we were terrified to leave our tent because the Black Forest is completely pitch black at night. We eventually worked up the courage, left the tent together, and went as a group. While we were doing our business, a friend of mine and I suddenly heard a woman screaming in the distance. We immediately started to panic and had no idea what to do, wondering if it could be a large animal coming toward us. An older guy who was with us, and I was 13 at the time, tried to calm us down and said it was probably just one animal running away from another, which happens in such a large forest. We went back to our tent and tried to relax. The rest of the camp was amazing, and we returned to Italy happy, almost forgetting about that night. A few weeks later, while I was at home reading things online, I got curious and looked to see if anything had happened in the area where we had been camping during the summer of 2006. I discovered that during the same period, in August 2006, a few kilometers away from where we were, a woman had been found dead. Story 8. I was 17 years old, at home watching my baby sister, who was 11. She was downstairs watching television, and I was upstairs playing video games and getting ready for bed. My sister was always great, and I trusted her to go to bed at a reasonable time. To my surprise, my mother peeked her head into my dark room, and I cheerfully waved goodnight. I could not see her face, just a head briefly leaning into my room, looking at me and pulling back. About half an hour later, I went downstairs to get some water and was surprised again, this time by my sister, still watching the end of her show. I did not mind that she was still awake, but my mother would have immediately sent her to bed since she was much stricter. My sister asked me if I knew when our parents would be home, and without saying much, I immediately took her hand, led her outside to my car, and we sat there while I called my parents, who came home right away. No doors or windows were unlocked except for the side door I opened to bring my sister outside. I still wonder who or what leaned its head into my room that night. Story 9. When I was younger, I was almost abducted by an older man. I had some errands to run, and it was already quite dark because it was winter. While I was walking, the man stopped me and started talking to me. He accused me of doing something I had not done, and then tried to grab my hand and pull me away from the street. I told him firmly to leave me alone, and managed to break free from his grip. I then noticed some people walking nearby and shouted toward them. He got the message and backed off, and I never saw him again. I was probably very close to disappearing forever too. At the time, it did not feel that scary, but looking back on it now, it is unsettling how easily someone can vanish. Another experience was much milder. A friend and I tried to contact spirits in my basement. While he was preparing what he called a ritual with a needle, candles, and a makeshift spirit board, I was holding his phone to use as a light. Suddenly, out of nowhere, his phone died, and we were left in complete darkness. We had not even started yet. Apparently, the battery just drained with no warning, because when he charged it later, it worked fine. Ever since then, I joke that it is best not to mess with spirits because they might drain your battery. Story 10. I hear a sound in my late grandfather's house that no one else seems to notice. Every time I have slept there, it has woken me up at least twice during the night. I usually try to explain it away as the central air conditioning making a strange noise. One night, I stayed up late in the living room, and the sound was even louder, clearly coming from the dining room. It startled me so badly that I jumped out of my seat. It is so loud that it constantly wakes me up. The best way I can describe it is like a very large paperback book falling off a table onto the floor and briefly bouncing. The first few times I heard it, I was half asleep and blamed it on my cat, even though my cat does not live in that house. I had stayed there many times before and never heard this sound until after he died. I know where he passed away, and it is not exactly where the sound comes from, which oddly gives me some comfort. The noise always comes from the dining room, and it is extremely loud. We rented the house out for 2 months, and the renters never mentioned it. Other family members who stayed there never complained either. It is very loud, and I seem to be the only one who ever hears it. I still hope it is just the sump pump and that I happened to be there at the right moment, but I honestly do not know how no one else has ever heard it. I have only stayed there for a couple of days at a time, but it has woken me up every single visit. Story 11, I was backpacking around Europe and ended up in Prague. One night I went out by myself and it was getting late, so I decided to catch what I thought would be the last trolley back to the hostel where I was staying. It was far from the city center, the final stop on the line, inexpensive, but actually a great place to stay. I made a serious mistake. I got completely mixed up, had no idea where I was, and ended up at the end of the line, which was not where I needed to be at all. I got off and found myself in a very industrial area where people likely used public transportation to commute to work. There were no houses, just occasional, sketchy figures emerging from the darkness. I waited for a trolley to take me back in the other direction, and even removed the memory card from my camera in case someone tried to rob me. The trolley never came, and after a while I realized I could not just sit there all night. I decided that if I walked back along the tracks, I would eventually head toward the city. I reached a river, and to follow the tracks I had to cross a bridge. I did not understand a word of Czech, but it was obvious the sign warned that crossing the bridge on foot was extremely dangerous. Still, I saw no other option and was fairly certain the trolleys had stopped running for the night. About halfway across, I felt and heard a deep rumble and saw lights approaching from behind me. There was no way I could outrun it. Without thinking, I grabbed the railing, jumped over, and clung to the outside of the bridge above the river as the trolley passed. I do not even think the driver noticed. Once it was gone, I pulled myself back over the railing and got off the bridge as fast as I could. I walked through some lower-income neighborhoods and saw a group of kids lighting things on fire in a parking lot, who definitely noticed me as much as I noticed them. I spotted a taxi, but I could not explain where I needed to go. Eventually, I saw a man carrying a saxophone on his back and thought that someone with a saxophone had to be friendly and knowledgeable. I quickened my pace, but he did too, so I finally shouted that I needed help figuring out where I was. He thought I was trying to rush him for his instrument, but he was kind and explained that my hostel was only about 2 blocks away. Story 12. One time I was waiting in my car while some friends were grabbing coffee from Starbucks. We had just picked up groceries, and I bought some grocery store sushi. While eating it, I grabbed a piece that was way too spicy because it had touched too much wasabi, and when it burned my mouth, I opened my door and spit it out. I sat back up, closed my door, and noticed a man who looked Asian approaching my car from the opposite rear side. He came over and knocked on the passenger window, signaling for me to talk or roll down the window. At first, I assumed he was checking on me because it probably looked like I had just thrown up out of my car. He did not say anything, just kept knocking and waving for me to talk to him. I shook my head no and tried to wave him away, but I had an immediate gut feeling of uneasiness and distrust. He then walked around and tried to open my door. Luckily, I had locked it just moments before, and I was so freaked out that I immediately pulled out with him right next to my car, not even checking if it was clear or if I might hit him with my mirror, and I reparked in a different spot in the lot while trying to call my friends to come outside. He left me alone, but then got into a car with another man who looked Middle Eastern, and both of them were wearing small headset earpieces. My instinct told me it felt like a trafficking or kidnapping situation, and it really shook me. A few minutes later, my friends came out, and as we were driving home, we ended up stopped next to the same car in a turning lane. My male friends, being protective, tried to confront them through the window to see what was going on, but the men completely ignored us. As soon as the light turned green, they sped off at around 60 miles an hour onto a different freeway. I called the police and reported their license plate. Story 13. Back when I still lived at home with my parents and my sister was still there, she was probably around 18 or 19 years old. I liked to sleep in, and my bedroom was in the basement, so it did not get much natural light. One morning I was jolted awake by what sounded like someone yelling my name. I checked the time, saw it was around 10, and figured it was time to get up anyway. I walked upstairs from the basement toward the entrance of our home that led into the kitchen, and I immediately saw that our front door was broken and there was a trail of blood leading from it, through the kitchen and into the rest of the house. Every possible horrible scenario ran through my head at once. It turned out that the mail carrier had startled my dog, She jumped on the door, and because it was glass, it shattered. She cut herself and, in fear, ran through the house, leaving a trail of blood. My mom picked her up in a panic, and we rushed to the veterinarian, terrified that she might bleed too much before we got there. You do not understand true stress until someone you love is crying in your back seat while holding someone they love, telling you to drive faster, and then moments later begging you to slow down because you cannot risk getting pulled over when there is no time to deal with it. On the way, we hit construction and came to a complete stop, which turned into the added stress of a parent insisting we had to find another way around it, even though there was no alternative. In the end, we made it. My dog was okay. My mom was shaken by the experience, and my back seat was covered in blood. It was one of the most stressful moments of my life, and thankfully the worst part afterward was trying to clean all the stains out of the carpet in the days that followed. Story 14. I live in a pretty rough area, and unfortunately my mother never thought it was important to invest in home security or properly take care of our very old house, which is important context for this story. One day I got home and noticed that my window was open. It was technically locked, but it was such an old window that it could be pushed open with very little effort. Since it was summer, I initially thought maybe my mom had opened it, but that was not the case. I started looking around my room and thankfully saw that my laptop was still sitting on my bed, my television was there, and my PlayStation 3 was untouched. Then I noticed that my drawers had clearly been rummaged through, and what was missing were all of my undergarments, including bras, underwear, and lingerie. I completely panicked. It was terrifying that nothing else of real value was taken, only those items. I was so shaken that I spent the night at a friend's house. About a year later, I met a guy online through OkCupid, and he came to my house to pick me up, with my car parked outside the entire time. I spent most of the day with him, and when I got home later, the exact same thing had happened again. I was devastated and called the police. I specifically mentioned that my car had been outside because it felt especially disturbing and bold for someone to break in knowing I lived there, which made me think they either wanted me to be home or knew I was not, meaning they could have been watching me leave. The police came and made a report, but they never caught whoever did it. Knowing that someone was disturbed and obsessed enough to break in and steal those items, and that they did it twice, still gives me chills. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I even made a post about it on Facebook at the time, and I still have messages from people who reached out to me after it happened. Story 15. My dad was deep in the logging woods around 5:30 in the morning when he noticed a man on the side of the trail, leaning against a tree with a bottle of rye whiskey resting between his legs. From the way my dad always told the story, the man looked like an older black man wearing overalls, and at first glance he just seemed asleep. Since this was miles into the woods, my dad decided to check on him. He started by saying, "Hey, mister," but there was no response. He leaned down and shook the man's shoulder. Still nothing. When that did not work, he went to slap the man's face, and the moment his hand touched him, my dad said all the blood drained from his own face and he nearly passed out. The man's skin was ice cold and had a strange waxy feel to it. He was very much dead, and my father was completely alone with him, deep in fog-covered woods. The worst part was trying to get the police out there. This was in the 1970s, so there was no way to just make a phone call. He had to drive out of the woods into a predominantly black area in the southern United States, alone early in the morning, as a white man in a truck full of chainsaws. He knocked on house after house, but no one wanted to open the door for a stranger like that at 6 in the morning. He always joked that most people probably looked out the window and decided not today. Eventually, a very skeptical family cracked the door open, and he begged to use the phone to call the police. The mother would not let him inside, but handed the phone to him through the doorway and asked what number he wanted to dial. He said 911. The police eventually arrived, interviewed him, and determined the man had wandered into the woods while drunk and died from exposure. There were no signs of foul play, no marks on him, just a man leaned against a tree with a bottle of rye. It might not sound terrifying to everyone, but knowing it really was a dead man and not nothing at all makes it one of the scariest stories I know. Story 16. This is one of the scariest experiences of my life, and it left me paralyzed with fear for the next 2 months. This happened about 11 years ago, when I was around 12 years old. We lived in an apartment building in a small city called Sakaka in Saudi Arabia. Every afternoon around 2, my dad would pick my mom, who was a teacher, and me up from school, and afterward I would usually go buy bread, called kabus, from a nearby store. During summer, the heat at that hour could reach around 50 degrees Celsius, so the streets were usually deserted except for the occasional car. That day I bought the bread and was walking back when I noticed a small red Jeep parked near the entrance of our building. I did not think much of it and went inside, heading for the stairs since all the apartments were on the first floor. In the lobby, there was a large Arab man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a white vest and pants, checking the electrical board. He was heavy-set, had short hair, a mustache, and smelled strongly of tobacco. I climbed a few steps when he noticed me and greeted me. I replied politely. He stepped closer and asked if I was Hindi, meaning an Indian expatriate, and I said yes. He then asked if I wanted money. I did not understand at first and told him I already had some. He repeated himself, saying he wanted to give me money, and then placed his hand over mine on the railing. That instant sent a surge of fear through me. I pulled my hand away, said no, and started moving quickly up the stairs. When I looked back, he was running after me, taking the steps 2 at a time. I tripped, fell, and screamed for my mother at the top of my lungs while scrambling up the last few steps. When I turned around, expecting to be grabbed, I saw him running back down the stairs, clearly startled by my scream. I ran down the hallway just as my apartment door opened, and my dad rushed out holding an iron rod, shouting. I ran straight to him and told him that a man had tried to grab me. I did not cry then or later, but my body was shaking uncontrollably. My dad took me downstairs to look for the car, and while we stood at the gate, my legs gave out, and I collapsed from shock. He carried me back upstairs. I refused to eat and went to bed, but woke up later drenched in sweat and terrified. I went to the kitchen, took a small knife, and kept it with me. I was afraid to leave the house for the next 2 months. I never explained exactly what the man wanted, but my parents understood it was serious. They stopped asking me to run errands and were gentle with me even when my school performance dropped. For a long time, I was constantly scanning for a small red Jeep and carried that knife, convinced I would use it if I ever saw him again. We eventually moved back to our home country years later. Life may be harder in some ways, but I have never felt that same kind of fear since, and I feel safer now than I ever did then. Story 17. I remember when I was very little, I was extremely close to my aunt. She was my aunt by marriage, my uncle's wife, and they lived downstairs from us in a 2-family house. She used to visit me all the time. One day I was sitting in the living room watching television while my mom, grandmother, and uncle were talking at the kitchen table. My uncle was crying, and when I asked why, they told me to leave the room. The only explanation I was given was that his pet bird was sick or something like that. Later, my aunt came upstairs like she always did. But instead of sitting with me and her daughter, she stood in the hallway and waved at me without ever coming into the living room. I thought she was playing a game, so I waved back and went back to watching my show. This happened more than once, and she never stepped fully into the room. Eventually, she stopped coming around altogether, and when I asked my mom about it, she told me that my aunt had moved away and separated from my uncle. Years later, around the holidays, I asked about her again and wondered why she never visited my cousin. I was around 12 at the time. My mom and grandma exchanged a look, and my grandma quietly left the room. My mom then told me that my aunt had taken her own life. She had done it when I was 5 years old. She drove out to the beach in the winter, knowing it would be empty, drank heavily, and overdosed on pills. Her car was found the next day. I told my mom that I used to see her standing in the hallway, waving and smiling at me, but my parents did not believe me. Story 18. During the last week of July last year, I went to Ocean City, Maryland with my boyfriend at the time. The first few nights were great, and I even got to see a longtime friend who lived there, who was with us the night everything happened. My boyfriend and my friend decided they wanted to get crab fries, but I was not interested because I do not like Old Bay seasoning on fries, so I chose to sit on a bench and wait. While I was sitting there, I noticed a family walking by, and behind them was their daughter. She looked extremely upset and was typing quickly on her phone like she was in the middle of an intense argument. She had short, bleached white hair and striking tattoos that really stood out to me. They were beautiful, and that is why I noticed her. When my boyfriend and friend came back, we walked behind that family for a bit, but eventually we got distracted by boardwalk performers and lost sight of them. I did not think much of it at the time. Around 2 in the morning, we were among the only people left on the boardwalk besides small groups of drunk teenagers smoking and yelling, and I saw her again, running toward the beach while crying. I wanted to check on her, but my boyfriend suggested we stay out of it, so we went back to the hotel and went to sleep. Around 6 in the morning, I quietly got up, rolled a joint, and stepped outside. Our hotel had a sitting area overlooking the ocean, and as I stood there enjoying the view, I saw her again. She was walking along the boardwalk, still crying, looking confused and frightened. I had an overwhelming gut feeling to follow her. I tucked the joint into my clutch and followed at a distance. She kept looking around like she was lost. I followed her all the way to the 2nd Street beach ramp, where she suddenly broke into a full sprint, crying hysterically. I shouted after her, asking if she needed help, and ran onto the beach. Suddenly, no one was there. I could hear quiet sobbing to my right, and as I followed the sound down the beach, I saw an arm sticking out of the sand. It was her arm. I recognized the tattoos immediately. The sobbing stopped, and all the normal sounds of the beach came rushing back. I screamed for someone to call 911, and a middle-aged couple ran over. The woman screamed, and the man called for help. When the police arrived and took my statement, I did not know what to say, so I told them I had just found her. It took hours to dig her out, and when they finally did, they escorted witnesses away. As we walked, I saw her standing behind the officers, looking down at her own body. She looked up at me, nodded, and disappeared. At first, reports said she had been sitting in a hole that collapsed, but later it was suggested that sand cleaning equipment may have pushed sand into it. The part that still haunts me is that she had been missing since around 2 in the morning and had died shortly after. Yet I saw her and followed her. She looked completely real. I still dream about her and remember every detail. Story 19. I have a couple of experiences that still unsettle me. When I was little, my parents took my brothers and me to Mexico to visit friends. While we were there, we ended up at a beach that was far off the beaten path. Further down the beach, there was a small child. I could not tell if it was a boy or a girl, sitting with a stroller that held a rag doll. When the child saw me, their eyes went wide, and they suddenly ran straight toward me. My parents were some distance away, but my older brothers were nearby. My oldest brother stepped in front of me and stomped his foot to make himself look intimidating. It worked because the child stopped and walked away, but the look they gave me was terrifying, and I remember feeling like something very bad was about to happen. Years later, I was driving to a police station to apply for a firearm permit. I did not realize the station had moved, and my navigation system led me down the wrong road. I pulled over to figure out where I was, and while I was sitting there, a man stood next to my car as if he were finishing a cigarette. I ignored him and kept looking at my directions. Suddenly, he opened my car door and started climbing inside, even dropping his bag into the footwell. I panicked and yelled at him to get out of my car. He immediately realized something was wrong, scrambled back out, and apologized before rushing away. I locked the door and drove off as fast as I could. It was not until about a year later that it hit me that he probably thought I was his ride, and that I had scared him just as badly as he scared me. Story 20. I grew up in a very small, very rural town in the southwest corner of California's Central Valley. When most people think of California, they imagine freeways, beaches, and crowds. But where I lived, there were places you could drive and be 30 miles from the nearest person. When I was 17 years old, my best friend and I decided to take his pickup truck southwest out of town, over the Tembler Mountain Range, and into the vast Carrizo Plains, a prehistoric dry lake that stretched roughly 35 miles east to west and 10 miles north to south. We stopped at the crest, about 4,000 feet up, and looked down over the massive valley below us. It was a clear late night, around midnight, and far below we both noticed a small orange flicker, maybe 2 or 3 miles away as the crow flies. It took about 15 minutes to reach it in four-wheel drive, heading down the backside of the mountain. When we arrived, we realized it was the glowing embers of a fire. There was no fire pit, no tire tracks, and no people. I pulled out a large spotlight, plugged it into the cigarette lighter, rolled down the passenger window and swept the area in a full circle. There was nothing, no one, no bushes or trees, just a flat, empty, dry lake bed. I brought the light back inside and we positioned the truck so we could spin the rear tires and smother the embers, since my friend was a literal Boy Scout. When I lifted my head back up, I saw him. To explain why this mattered, southwest Kern County in the mid-1990s was overwhelmingly white. In a town of about 25,000 people, there was exactly one black family. Less than 50 years earlier, there had been an openly racist warning sign on the road into town, and that legacy still hung over the area. Standing outside my window was the largest man I had ever seen. Black, somewhere between 6'4" and 6'7", extremely muscular. Naked except for a pair of small, ripped denim shorts. He was staring directly at me, less than an arm's length away, with a wide-eyed smile that felt dangerous. I looked at my friend and screamed for him to go. And from the look on his face, I knew he had seen something too. The truck tore off in a cloud of dust. I shouted if he had seen that, and he snapped back asking why I was yelling and what was wrong. My stomach dropped. I explained exactly what I had seen, in detail, and I could tell he believed me. Here is the part that still makes no sense. There were at least 20 different ways back into town from where we were. Dirt roads, mountain routes, and long looping paths. My friend drove fast, taking a completely different route than the one we had used earlier. It took nearly 40 minutes before we saw the lights of town. As we came down a paved road on the south side, the same man stepped out from behind a line of tumbleweeds onto the shoulder, still nearly unclothed, staring straight at us. As we passed, we both twisted around to keep looking at him, and he deliberately wagged his index finger at us in a mocking, warning gesture. I begged my friend to tell me he saw it, and he nodded, asking if it was the same guy. To this day, it is the only truly unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me, because there is no way he could have known which route we would take, and no possible way he could have beaten us there. Story 21. This might seem mild compared to other stories, and I have told it before, but it has always stayed with me. Growing up, my dad's best friend was a man I will call Ted. Ted was married to a woman I will call Brenda, and he had a son from a previous marriage named Timmy, who was a couple of years older than me. One day when I was about 6 years old, my parents, Ted, Brenda, and Timmy, were eating at a French bistro owned by another friend. It was a more upscale place, so Timmy, who was around 9 or 10, and I got bored and asked if we could play outside. Our parents agreed, as long as we stayed on the lawn in front of the restaurant. The lawn had small clusters of trees and bushes, so we started playing hide and seek. When it was my turn to count, I stood in a small clearing, closed my eyes, and started counting. I heard a crunch behind me and thought I had caught Timmy, but suddenly he jumped out in front of me and shouted for me to stop. I turned around and saw a man around 19 or 20 years old standing less than 10 feet away in the middle of pulling his pants down. He panicked and muttered something about not seeing us and just needing to use the bathroom, which made no sense given that we were in public near a nice restaurant. It was early evening, and there were businesses and a gas station right across the street. Even at 6 years old, I knew something was very wrong. Timmy immediately told me to run back inside and get our dads, ordering me to move fast and saying he would be right behind me. When I hesitated, he raised his voice and told me he was older and in charge, and that scared me enough to run. I burst inside crying, unable to fully explain what happened, and our dads rushed to go outside. But Timmy came back moments later and told them the man had taken off running toward a wooded area across the street. The police were called but never found anyone, and even if they had, there was not much they could have charged him with. Looking back, I am convinced he saw a small child alone in a secluded spot and decided to take the chance, which is terrifying. On a brighter note, we are still close with Ted and Timmy today. Timmy later joined the Marines and was not around much when I was growing up, but when I turned 21, the first bar I went to was one he knew well, so I invited him. He showed up, drank slowly, and spent the whole night quietly watching over us. I am an only child, but he has always felt like a protective older brother. Story 22. I am from a metropolitan city in Canada, And when I was 12 years old, which puts me in my mid-20s now, my siblings and I were still taking summer family vacations to the Maritimes with our parents. We had gone to Prince Edward Island 5 summers in a row, so my dad decided to change things up and look for vacation spots in Nova Scotia, since the timing lined up with a conference he had in Halifax. This was before the age of Yelp, TripAdvisor, Airbnb, and similar sites, and he was searching for a cottage or summer home in a province he did not know very well. He came across a website called Heaven's Gate, which advertised a quaint summer home on a small island called Big Tancook in Nova Scotia, with a population of around 200 people. The owner explained on the website that she had named the home Heaven's Gate because of a tragic accident that caused the untimely deaths of her husband and 2 children. We assumed it might have been a boating accident or a car crash. The way it was written made it sound like a fluke or freak incident. The house looked idyllic, right on the ocean, and my dad thought it would be a nice 5-day getaway before we went to Halifax and stayed in a hotel. He booked it, and we drove to a small town called Chester, where we would take the ferry to Big Tancook. The ferry only ran twice a day, so if you went in the morning, you were committing to being there all day. We parked in Chester, got on the ferry, and by pure coincidence, the property owner was on the ferry as well. My dad recognized her from the photo on the website, and they made awkward small talk for about 40 minutes about the island and things to do, while my siblings and I searched the water for dolphins. When we arrived, the owner told us her niece would drive us up to the house because it sat at the top of a steep hill, and we had several suitcases. We met the niece, said goodbye to the owner, and headed up. As soon as we arrived, my sister and I ran inside exploring every room, including the creepy cellar, while my parents stayed on the porch talking to the niece. I found a play structure with a swing set behind the house and went to play, noticing a plaque dedicated to 2 red-headed boys who had passed away recently, which I assumed were the owner's sons. A few minutes later, my sister came out looking pale and shaken. Eventually, she told me that our mother had politely asked what happened to the boys and their father, and the niece casually explained that one morning the husband snapped, grabbed a rifle, killed his 2 sons, and then himself, inside the very house we were staying in for 5 days. What had seemed peaceful instantly became the most tense and unsettling place I had ever been. Photos of the boys were everywhere, their toys were still in their bedrooms, and their drawings and poems were framed on the walls. My brother could even see the cemetery where they were buried from his bedroom window. None of us slept the first night, and by the second day, my parents were making plans to leave early. I was terrified and could not even shower alone. We stayed outside as much as possible, but the cottage was next to the island school, and everywhere were plaques and reminders of what had happened. We forced ourselves through one more sleepless night, my mom covering photos and hiding toys, then left at dawn on the 3rd day to catch the first ferry. My parents said they had never seen us pack so fast, probably because we barely unpacked. A few months later, the owner sent my dad a survey asking how our stay had been. He never replied. Story 23. When I was in my early 20s, my fiancé and I moved into a townhouse apartment in a town that was known at the time to have at least one active serial killer. It was later revealed there were actually 2 operating separately, but during this story it was believed that all the murders, mostly of young women, were the work of one person. I knew about it but was young and felt invincible. We had not yet moved our washer and dryer in, so I was using the shared laundry room. I was juggling school and work, so it was late when I walked back to our townhouse carrying a full basket of clothes. Our unit was the last one in the row and the farthest from the laundry room. I was wearing headphones and not paying attention, so when I unlocked the door, I immediately went upstairs to the 2nd floor without thinking. My fiancé was in the kitchen, which faced the front door, and when he looked up, he saw a man dressed in black following me inside. My fiancé screamed and ran toward the man, who immediately bolted back out the door and vanished into the night. I will never know if he was one of the serial killers, but I believe with every part of me that if my fiancé had not been there, something truly horrific would have happened to me that night. Story 24. When I was in high school, there was a little-known place about an hour from my hometown that was famous for cliff diving into water. It was completely in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest anything about 10 miles away. It was a popular spot, not just for the jumps, but because it was also a place where people thought they could get away with things like underage drinking. The cliffs ranged from about 15 feet to roughly 80 feet high. One specific cliff, known as the tabletop, was about 40 to 50 feet depending on the water level. Beneath it were rocks that you had to clear by jumping outward. If you jumped straight down, you would hit the rocks. It was not difficult to clear as long as you pushed forward, and I had never seen anyone come within 10 feet of the rocks. One day, a group of kids showed up who had been drinking throughout the day. No one was completely drunk, but they were clearly affected. Two girls decided they wanted to jump off the tabletop, even though they had never done it before and were terrified. They decided to hold hands and jump together. As they approached the edge, the first girl suddenly panicked and stopped right at the lip. The second girl tried to slow down as well, but could not stop her momentum and barely tipped off the edge with no forward push at all. About halfway down the cliff, there was a section that stuck out slightly, like a belly in the rock face. She hit it, which killed a lot of her downward momentum, but caused her body to flatten out instead of staying vertical. She struck the edge of the rocks and then rolled into the water. I watched the entire thing from another cliff about 30 feet away. Her body floated to the surface, surrounded by blood. Several people, including me, jumped into the water to help. Others reached her first and dragged her to shore. She had a large gash on the side of her head and cuts on her elbows and arms. She was unresponsive for about 90 seconds, though it felt like 10 minutes, and then suddenly she started coughing and crying. I had to run about half a mile to get enough phone service to call for an ambulance, which took 20 to 30 minutes to arrive because of how remote the area was. In the end, she suffered cuts, severe soreness, and a major concussion, but she fully recovered. That happened about 8 years ago, and it still haunts me. At the time, I was certain I had just watched someone die. I still have nightmares about it, and she was unbelievably lucky to survive. Story 25. This is probably not the scariest story here, but it happened very recently and still has me shaken. I was leaving my significant other's apartment around 11 at night. Residents leave their trash cans out in the hall overnight for maintenance to collect, so there were cans and loose trash lining the hallway like usual. As I walked past one, I did a double take because next to it was a small pile of odds and ends, including a large glass jar that immediately caught my eye as something useful. I assumed it had been put out for trash, picked it up, and entered the stairwell. Suddenly, the door slammed open behind me. A man in his 20s with very long brown hair started screaming at me, accusing me of stealing his property. For context, I am a 5'4" woman, and every warning signal in my body went off. I handed the jar back and apologized, explaining that I thought it was trash. He yelled that it came from his storage unit and screamed that what was wrong with the building? He was intensely angry and I was terrified. I ran down the stairwell, hearing him follow behind me, still shouting. I burst into the parking deck, ran a short distance, then realized he could easily see me, so I ducked behind a car and crouched down, hiding. I heard the door slam again, and his voice still echoing as he shouted insults. I was crying and shaking, completely frozen. After a short while, it went quiet and I heard the door close again. I stayed hidden for about 15 minutes before pulling out my phone and calling my partner to come walk me the rest of the way. Story 26. My friend and I became deeply involved in making music, eventually building a small studio in his garage where I spent most weekends working and recording. One night, he casually asked me if I would ever sell my soul to become famous. I immediately said no, explaining that I believed in God, the devil, heaven, and hell, and that such a thing would come at a terrible cost. His cousin jumped in and said he would do it without hesitation. I stood firm, saying it was not something I would ever consider. Over time, my friend and his cousin began performing shows and gaining more attention than usual. My friend was never easily scared or nervous. But one weekend when I went over, he met me outside, standing by the fence, clearly lost in thought. After a long pause, he asked if I remembered the question about selling his soul. Then he asked if I knew what Santa Muerte was, describing her as a figure who could give you anything you wanted, good or bad, as long as you devoted your life to her. He admitted that he had asked her for help. I became angry, telling him that it sounded like something dark disguising itself as something else. He explained that the initials on their recording booth did not stand for self-made, but were meant to honor her. After that, opportunities had started appearing, shows, connections, even a meeting with a local radio host about playing their song. Then he told me about a night at a red light when a homeless man appeared out of nowhere, dancing strangely, asked what song they were listening to, and when told it was theirs, said they would go far but that there was something dark around them. What disturbed me most was how my friend suddenly began talking about God with complete certainty, saying he finally understood love and goodness, even though he had admitted just a week earlier that he had never believed. He told me that while on the phone with a girl, she asked him to send a photo. After he did, she asked if he prayed to Santa Muerte, claiming she could see something standing behind him in the picture. That terrified him enough to renounce everything and turn back to God. We prayed together, trying to calm the situation. Later that night, we went to a golf course after dark to relax. While standing there, he suddenly froze, said he saw something moving between the trees, and insisted we leave. As we approached the fence, the sprinklers directly in front of us turned on in the shape of a cross, with no others activating, which convinced him something was trying to stop us. A couple of weeks later, we were in the studio when he was recording, and his cousin and I heard the door latch move. My friend insisted it was impossible because he had locked it, and as he pointed to the lock, the door swung open on its own. He panicked, kicked the door shut, and ran out in tears, convinced something was after him. Later, he went to rehabilitation after a minor legal issue and told me that while there, another resident described seeing a tall, hooded figure standing over him while he slept. Today, he is married and stable, but he still feels that whatever followed him never truly left. Story 27. It was summer in the early 2000s, and I was around 10 to 12 years old when my friend who lived next door to me for most of my childhood told me she knew a cool place with lots of cats. Being an animal lover, I was excited. It was just a short walk down the main road we both lived on. The house itself looked normal, small, white, with black shingles, but I did not know the owners. I was a shy and cautious kid, and my mom had always told me that strangers did not have your best interests in mind. We met a woman who looked to be in her 50s or 60s, and she led us to an old shed behind her house. For context, my house was maybe 30 yards from the road. Hers was closer to 100 yards back, and the shed was another 30 yards beyond that. Even at that age, I felt uneasy. Something felt wrong. When she opened the shed, cats of all ages scattered everywhere. As a kid, I found it magical, and I relaxed a little. We played with the cats, though most of them were sick, with discharge from their eyes and noses, clearly feral outdoor cats. There was even a dead kitten. The woman picked it up, held it out for us to see, said something like she liked that one, and then threw it into the trash. About 20 minutes later, I felt uneasy again and wanted to go home. I felt bad for the cats, but I wanted to leave. Suddenly, the woman's husband came out of the house. He was around the same age, clean-shaven, wearing a white shirt with black suspenders. He said it was hot out and asked if we wanted to come inside for a popsicle. My friend immediately ran toward the house and I followed closely, mostly to keep an eye on her. She went inside, but I stopped in the doorway. He tried to lead us toward the basement, and every instinct in my body screamed that this was a bad idea. I grabbed my friend's arm to stop her. I told him that my mom was probably worried because we had not told her where we were going and that we should leave. I dragged my friend out. She was furious with me. I gave her a popsicle from our freezer at home and told my mom everything. She forbade us from ever going back. About 6 years later, we learned that the same man who tried to lead us into the basement had assaulted a young boy. I do not know what his intentions were with us, but I will never forget the feeling of looking down those basement stairs and knowing it was a trap. Story 28. I was 18 years old in the Navy and away from my parents for the first time. I often helped plan nights out, and we went out almost every night of the week. After a couple of months of heavy partying, I was exhausted, but went out anyway. We usually stayed together and went to the same bar, which had become our regular spot. That night, I had 3 drinks. By the second one, I got separated from my group. 2 men started hanging around me, and I began to feel fuzzy and disoriented. I tried to get back to my friends, but they blocked me and handed me another drink. The next thing I remember, I was in a car. They drove for a long time talking about partying. We arrived at a house with wooden floors and a fireplace. One of them was loud and aggressive, clearly in charge, while the other was quieter and seemed to look after me. He laid me down on a couch, which was the only furniture in the room. I think I fell asleep. I heard the louder one talking about getting me up and pushing substances, which I refused. Things became blurry again. Then I heard him telling the other to undress me and saying they were going to take advantage of me. The quieter one began undoing my pants. Through the haze, I shouted that I was on my period and asked if they were trying to assault me. The aggressive one became furious, yelling that we had wasted their time and money and ordered the other to get me out before he hurt me. Somehow I was walking, though I could barely feel my legs. The quiet one asked where I lived, and I told him the Navy base. When he realized I was military, his demeanor changed completely. He apologized repeatedly and drove me back to the base, where we were waved through security. He begged me not to say anything and then left. I survived. I told my friends what happened, tore into them for leaving me alone, and never went out with them again. After that, I stayed sober and watched out for other women. I later ran into those two men again and made it clear they were not welcome near me. Looking back, I believe they were separating women from their friends and substancing them. I often wonder why I did not report it immediately, but I was young, scared, and confused. I survived by thinking quickly and lying, and I will never forget that night. Story 29. I was walking my dog around a lake near my home. The lake runs alongside a golf course, with a path looping all the way around it. It is beautiful in the summer, full of trees and usually very peaceful. I was walking with my dog, who I will call Nati, when he suddenly stopped dead and stared into the trees. T is the friendliest dog imaginable and loves everyone, but I have seen him react very differently around people who later turned out to be dangerous and around places that felt wrong. He also reacts strongly to a photograph in my house of a family friend who passed away, staring at it and whining or wagging his tail as if interacting with it. This time, as he stared into the trees, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave immediately. I picked him up, even though he weighs close to 20 kilograms, and started jogging away. The entire time he looked over my shoulder, growling, baring his teeth, and snapping, trying to appear as threatening as possible. Once we reached an open area, I put him down, though he kept glancing behind us. Further along the path, near a river, I noticed a car submerged in the water. It was still smoking, with fuel leaking into the river, as if it had only just been dumped. I called the non-emergency police line to report it. While I was explaining my location, the operator asked if I was alone, and then told me to get to the nearest place with other people as quickly as possible. I grabbed T and ran toward the boathouse nearby, where there are usually people around. When I arrived, the operator told me that just minutes earlier, another call had come in from a woman walking her dog on the same path who had been attacked in the trees. My blood ran cold as I realized T had likely sensed what I could not see. If I had arrived only minutes earlier, it could have been me. That night, T got the best meal and more treats than ever. As gentle as he is, he knows exactly when to protect. Story 30. When I was around 11 or 12 years old, my parents sent me to a religious day camp, literally called Jesus Camp. We did typical camp activities like swimming, playing games, and group worship. The priest in charge of my age group was always around, swimming with us, playing games, and showing us hidden places to avoid our parents. And at first he seemed like a cool, involved adult. One night he invited me to stay up late to play checkers with him, saying I needed one-on-one counseling about my faith. We stayed up until around 2 in the morning talking about life and religion, and at that age I was just excited to be awake, not alarmed. As the camp went on, I began to feel uneasy about him. He started pushing boundaries, encouraging fear-based teachings and extreme devotion, talking about sin, repentance, and obedience. He told us that he refused to bless his own father on his deathbed because his father would not renounce being Lutheran and convert to Catholicism. On the second to last day of camp, he gave a lesson about the rapture, explaining that Jesus could return at any moment to claim souls for heaven. He asked us to meditate on our sins in total silence, then suddenly asked which of us would be ready if Jesus entered the room right then, telling those who were ready to stand. A heavy, sick feeling pinned me to my seat. I saw other children standing, then looked at my twin brother beside me as he began to rise. I grabbed his hand, stared him in the eyes, shook my head, and mouthed no.